The plane shuddered as it climbed through the clouds, a low groan vibrating through the cabin. Elias Rivera clutched the armrest, his knuckles pale, not because of the turbulence, but because of the whispers slithering through the rows behind him. "Look at him, with that scarf," a man muttered, his voice dripping with disdain, loud enough to carry over the hum of the engines. Elias adjusted the bright teal scarf around his neck, a gift from his sister, and stared out the window. The San Francisco skyline was shrinking below, a glittering grid of dreams he was leaving behind for a new start in New York. He'd boarded Flight 214 with hope, but the murmurs from the other passengers, businessmen in stiff suits, families with restless kids, felt like a weight pressing against his chest. He was used to it, the sideways glances, the snickers. Being openly gay in a world that still sharpened its edges against people like him wasn't new. But today, the sting felt sharper, maybe because he was alone, 30,000 feet in the air, with nowhere to escape. Beside him, in the aisle seat, sat Marcus Tate, a man whose presence seemed to command the space around him. Marcus was all sharp lines, tailored blazer, crisp white shirt, dark eyes that scanned the cabin like a hawk. He hadn't said much since they boarded, just a polite nod when Elias took the window seat. But now, as the whispers grew louder, Marcus shifted, his jaw tightening. "Ignore them," he said, his voice low, steady, like a tether pulling Elias back from the edge of humiliation. "They're just bored." Elias forced a smile, but it wobbled. Easier said than done. Marcus leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Want to know a secret? I'm terrified of flying." His lips quirked into a half-smile, and for the first time, Elias noticed the faintest dimple on his cheek. It was disarming, that flicker of vulnerability from a man who looked like he could stare down a storm. "You? Scared?" Elias raised an eyebrow, grateful for the distraction. "You look like you could fly this thing yourself." Marcus chuckled, but his eyes flicked to the window, betraying a flicker of unease. "Let's just say I'd rather be on solid ground. But you—" He gestured to Elias's scarf. "You're bold. I respect that." The compliment landed softly like a warm breeze. Elias felt his shoulders relax, just a fraction. He didn't know Marcus, but there was something about him, maybe the way he carried himself, or the way he didn't flinch at the stairs, that made Elias feel seen, not as a spectacle, but as a person. The plane leveled off, and the cabin settled into a hum of routine. Flight attendants moved down the aisle, offering drinks. Elias sipped his ginger ale, stealing glances at Marcus, who was flipping through a worn copy of The Alchemist. The book's spine was creased, like it had been read a dozen times. "Good book?" Elias asked, testing the waters. Marcus looked up, his eyes softening. "The best. It's about following your dreams, even when the world tries to stop you." He paused, then added, "Kind of feels like you might get that." Elias's breath caught. It was a small thing, but it felt like Marcus had seen right through him, through the scarf, the whispers, the armor he wore to face the world. Before he could respond, a sharp jolt rocked the plane. Gasps rippled through the cabin. The seatbelt sign pinged on, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but clipped. "Folks, we're hitting some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated." The plane lurched again, harder this time. Elias gripped the armrest, his heart pounding. Marcus's hand brushed against his, a fleeting touch, but it was enough to ground him. "It's okay," Marcus said, though his own knuckles were white. "Just a bumpy ride." But the bumps didn't stop. The plane dipped suddenly, and a woman across the aisle screamed. Trays clattered in the galley. Elias's ginger ale spilled, soaking his lap. The whispers from earlier were gone, replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the creak of the plane and the occasional whimper from a child. Then came the sound that froze Elias's blood, a thud from the cockpit, heavy and wrong, followed by a frantic shout. The plane tilted sharply, and the intercom crackled again, this time with a flight attendant's voice, high and panicked. "Is there a doctor on board? We need a doctor immediately." Marcus was on his feet before Elias could process it, his book tumbling to the floor. "I'm not a doctor," he called, striding toward the front, "but I'm a pilot." The cabin erupted in murmurs, some skeptical, others desperate. Elias watched, stunned, as Marcus disappeared behind the curtain, separating the cockpit from the cabin. The plane shuddered again, and Elias's stomach dropped. He didn't know Marcus, didn't know if he was telling the truth, but the man's confidence was a lifeline in the chaos. The whispers from earlier, the sneers about Elias's scarf, his softness, felt trivial now. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and Marcus was the only one stepping into the void. Minutes crawled by. The flight attendants huddled near the galley, their faces pale. Passengers clutched each other, some praying, others crying. Elias stared at the curtain, willing Marcus to come back with good news. When he finally did, his expression was grim, his blazer slightly askew. He leaned down to Elias, his voice low but urgent. "The pilot's unconscious. Heart attack, maybe. The co-pilots try and stabilize him, but they need me up there." Elias's mouth went dry. "You can fly this?" Marcus hesitated, just for a second, and that flicker of doubt hit Elias like a punch. "I've got a commercial license," Marcus said. "Haven't flown a 737 in a while, but I can do this." He didn't sound entirely convinced, but he straightened, his resolve hardening. "Stay calm, okay? I need you to keep it together." Elias nodded, though his heart was racing. As Marcus turned back toward the cockpit, a man in a nearby row, the same one who'd mocked Elias earlier, scoffed. "Him? He's going to save us? Good luck." The words were a knife, but Marcus didn't flinch. He just kept moving, his shoulders squared, like he was carrying the weight of every soul on board. Elias stared out the window, the clouds now dark and churning. The plane felt like a fragile thing, a metal shell hurtling through the sky with only Marcus to hold it steady. He didn't know why, but he believed in him. Maybe it was the dimple, or the way Marcus had seen him when no one else did. Whatever it was, Elias clung to it, a spark of hope in the gathering storm. The cabin lights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the faces of the passengers. Elias's fingers dug into the armrest, his scarf now a crumpled heap in his lap, soaked with ginger ale. The plane's nose dipped again, and a collective gasp swept through the rows, a sound that carried the raw edge of fear. In the cockpit, Marcus stood behind the co-pilot, a wiry man named Jenkins whose hands trembled as he tried to stabilize the controls. The pilot, Captain Reynolds, was slumped in his seat, his face gray, a flight attendant pressing a defibrillator to his chest. The cockpit was a claustrophobic maze of blinking lights and screens, the air thick with the tang of sweat and panic. Marcus's heart pounded, but he forced his voice to stay steady. "What's the status?" he asked, scanning the instrument panel. Jenkins didn't look up. Autopilot's disengaged. "We're losing altitude." Reynolds was handling the approach to Denver when his voice cracked. "I can't do this alone. I'm not rated for this." Marcus swallowed hard. He hadn't flown a plane this size in over a year, not since he'd left his job at a regional airline after a messy fallout with his boss. But there was no time to dwell on that now. "Okay," he said, slipping into the captain's seat as the flight attendant dragged Reynolds to the floor. "Talk me through the approach." "Denver's what, 200 miles out?" 180, Jenkins corrected, his eyes darting to the altimeter. "But we're off course. Weather's turning bad, thunderstorms ahead." Marcus's stomach twisted, but he nodded, his hands moving to the yoke. The controls felt heavier than he remembered, like the plane was resisting him. He glanced at the weather radar, a blotch of red and yellow pulsing over Denver. "We'll go around it," he said, more to himself than Jenkins. "Give me the approach charts." Back in the cabin, Elias felt the plane steady slightly, but the tension was suffocating. The passengers were a mix of silent dread and restless agitation. A woman clutched her rosary, lips moving in silent prayer. A teenager scrolled frantically on his phone, though there was no signal. The man who'd mocked Elias earlier was now pale, his bravado gone, his hands gripping his wife's arm. Elias leaned forward, straining to hear any sound from the cockpit. He didn't know Marcus, not really, but the man's quiet confidence had left an imprint. He thought of their brief conversation, the way Marcus had admitted his fear of flying. It wasn't just vulnerability, it was honesty, raw and unguarded. Elias envied that. He'd spent so long hiding parts of himself, folding them away to avoid the stares, the judgment. But Marcus didn't seem to care what anyone thought. He just acted. The intercom crackled, and Marcus's voice filled the cabin, steady but urgent. "This is Marcus Tate, your temporary captain. The pilots had a medical emergency, but we're working to get this plane on the ground safely. Please stay seated and follow the flight attendant's instructions." A pause, then softer, "We're going to be okay." The words should have been comforting, but they sparked a fresh wave of murmurs. "Temporary captain," the man across the aisle muttered. "Who the hell is this guy?" His wife shushed him, but the doubt in her eyes was clear. Elias wanted to snap back, to tell them Marcus was their best shot, but he stayed quiet, his gaze fixed on the curtain separating the cabin from the cockpit. The plane banked sharply, and Elias's heart lurched. He closed his eyes, picturing Marcus at the controls, those sharp eyes scanning the horizon. He didn't know why he trusted him. Maybe it was the way Marcus had looked at him, not with pity or judgment, but with something like recognition, like they were both outsiders in their own way. In the cockpit, Marcus wrestled with the yoke, the plane bucking against a sudden gust. The weather radar showed the storm closing in, a wall of turbulence they couldn't avoid. "Denver Tower, this is Flight 214, he said into the headset, his voice calm despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "We've got a medical emergency and a single pilot, requesting priority landing and vectors to avoid the storm." The controller's voice crackled back, tense but professional. "Flight 214, cleared for immediate approach to runway 34L. Turn heading 270, descend to 10,000 feet. Be advised, weather's deteriorating." Marcus relayed the instructions to Jenkins, who was now monitoring the co-pilot's instruments. The flight attendant, a woman named Carla, hovered nearby, her hands shaking as she checked Reynolds's pulse. "He's still out," she whispered. "The defibrillator's not working." "Keep trying," Marcus said, his focus locked on the controls. The plane was heavy, sluggish, fighting him every step. He thought of the passengers behind him, Elias, with his teal scarf and quiet courage, the families, the skeptics, the scared kids. He couldn't let them down. The plane broke through a layer of clouds, and Denver's lights flickered in the distance, faint through the rain-streaked windshield. Marcus's hands steadied, his fear giving way to muscle memory. He'd trained for this, even if it felt like a lifetime ago. "We're going to make it," he said, half to Jenkins, half to himself. In the cabin, Elias felt the plane level out, the turbulence easing for a moment. He glanced at the other passengers, their faces a mix of hope and terror. He wanted to believe Marcus's words, but the storm outside was growing louder, the lightning flashing closer. He clutched his scarf, the fabric soft against his fingers, and whispered a quiet prayer, not to any god, but to Marcus, the stranger who'd seen him when no one else had. The storm roared outside, a beast clawing at the plane's metal skin. Lightning cracked, illuminating the cabin in stark white flashes, each one etching fear deeper into the passengers' faces. Elias pressed his forehead against the window, the glass cold against his skin, and watched the clouds churn like a living thing. In the cockpit, Marcus's hands were slick with sweat, but his grip on the yoke was iron. The instrument panel was a chaos of flashing warnings, low altitude, high crosswinds, engine strain. Jenkins, the co-pilot, was muttering coordinates, his voice fraying at the edges. "We're at 8,000 feet, he said. "Winds are 40 knots, gusting to 60. This is going to be rough." "Rough I can handle," Marcus said, his eyes locked on the runway lights flickering through the rain. Denver International was close now, but the storm was closer, a wall of wind and water battering the plane. He adjusted the throttle, coaxing the engines to hold steady. Every muscle in his body was taut, his mind racing through years of training, simulations, near misses. He'd never landed a 737 in conditions this bad, but there was no choice. Not with 150 lives behind him. Carla, the flight attendant, knelt beside Captain Reynolds, her hand steady now as she performed CPR. Come on, she whispered, her voice a desperate rhythm against the storm's howl. Reynolds's chest rose and fell under her hands, but his eyes stayed closed, his face a mask of gray. Carla, update me, Marcus called without turning. No change, she said, her voice tight. He's not responding. Marcus nodded, his jaw clenched. He couldn't think about Reynolds now, couldn't think about the man dying 3 feet away. He had to focus on the runway, the wind, the plane. He had to focus on Elias, whose face kept flashing in his mind. Those soft brown eyes, that teal scarf, the way he'd smiled despite the cruelty around him. In the cabin, Elias felt the plane shudder again, a violent lurch that sent a tray crashing to the floor. A child wailed, and the man who'd mocked him earlier was now silent, his face buried in his hands. Elias wanted to feel vindicated, but all he felt was fear, sharp and cold. He closed his eyes, picturing Marcus in the cockpit, his hands steady, his dimple flashing in that fleeting moment of connection. It was a small thing to hold on to, but it was enough. The intercom crackled again, Marcus's voice cutting through the chaos. Folks, we're on final approach to Denver. It's going to be a bumpy landing, so brace yourselves and stay calm. We've got this. His voice was a lifeline, steady and sure, but Elias caught the faintest tremor in it, a crack in the armor that made his heart ache. The plane tilted, the nose dipping as the engines roared. Elias gripped the armrest, his scarf clutched in his other hand. He didn't pray, didn't beg, but he sent a silent plea to the universe. Let Marcus do this. Let him be enough. In the cockpit, Marcus wrestled with the controls, the plane fighting him like a living thing. The runway was visible now, a thin strip of lights blurred by rain. The crosswinds were brutal, shoving the plane sideways, and the altimeter was screaming. Flaps 30, he called to Jenkins, who scrambled to comply. Flap set, Jenkins said, his voice shaking. We're at 500 feet. Too low. Not yet, Marcus said, his eyes narrowed. He could feel the plane's weight, its resistance, but he could also feel its strength. It was a machine, not a monster. He just had to guide it home. The ground rushed up, the runway lights growing brighter. Marcus's heart pounded, but his hands were steady, his mind clear. He thought of Elias, of the courage it took to wear that scarf, to face the world unapologetically. If Elias could do that, Marcus could do this. 100 feet, Jenkins called. Winds gusting 65. Hold on, Marcus said, his voice a growl. The plane swayed, the left wing dipping dangerously. He corrected, his hands moving on instinct, muscle memory taking over. The runway was right there, so close, but the storm was relentless, pushing them off course. In the cabin, Elias braced himself, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the window. The ground was visible now, a blur of lights and asphalt rushing toward them. The plane shook violently, and a woman screamed. Elias wanted to reach out, to comfort someone, anyone, but he was frozen, his heart pounding in time with the engines. The wheels hit the runway with a bone-rattling thud, the plane skidding slightly before Marcus yanked the yoke, forcing it to stay straight. The reverse thrusters roared, slowing the beast, and the cabin erupted in gasps and sobs. Elias's breath caught, his eyes stinging with tears he hadn't realized were there. They were on the ground. They were alive. The plane screeched to a stop, the cabin lurching as the engines whined down. For a moment, there was silence, heavy and surreal, broken only by the patter of rain against the fuselage. Then, like a dam breaking, the passengers erupted, some in cheers, others in sobs, a chaotic symphony of relief. Elias exhaled, his hands trembling as he unclenched the armrest. His scarf was a damp tangle in his lap, but he didn't care. They were alive. Marcus had done it. He looked toward the cockpit curtain, his chest tight with something he couldn't name, gratitude, awe, maybe something deeper. In the cockpit, Marcus slumped back in the seat, his hands still gripping the yoke, as if letting go would unravel everything. His heart was a drum, his shirt clinging to his skin with sweat. Jenkins was pale, his hands shaking as he powered down the systems. "You did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You actually did it." Marcus didn't respond. He was still processing, still feeling the weight of the storm, the runway, the lives in his hands. Carla was still with Reynolds, her hands moving mechanically as she continued CPR. "He's got a pulse," she said suddenly, her voice breaking with hope. "It's weak, but it's there. Get the medics up here," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. He stood, his legs unsteady, and pushed through the curtain into the cabin. The passengers' faces were a blur, some clapping, some crying, some staring at him like he was a ghost. And then he saw Elias, those soft brown eyes wide with relief, and something in Marcus's chest loosened. Elias stood, ignoring the protests of the flight attendants, and met Marcus halfway down the aisle. "You're insane," Elias said, his voice trembling with a mix of laughter and tears. "You actually landed it." Marcus managed a weak smile, that dimple flashing. "Told you I could." Before Elias could respond, the man who'd mocked him earlier stood, his face flushed. "Hey, Kinshi." The plane screeched to a stop, the cabin lurching as the engines whined down. For a moment, there was silence, heavy and surreal, broken only by the patter of rain against the fuselage. Then, like a dam breaking, the passengers erupted, some in cheers, others in sobs, a chaotic symphony of relief. Elias exhaled, his hands trembling as he unclenched the armrest. His teal scarf was a damp tangle in his lap, but he didn't care. They were alive. Marcus had done it. He looked toward the cockpit curtain, his chest tight with something he couldn't name, gratitude, awe, maybe something deeper. In the cockpit, Marcus slumped back in the seat, his hands still gripping the yoke, as if letting go would unravel everything. His heart was a drum, his shirt clinging to his skin with sweat. Jenkins, the co-pilot, was pale, his hands shaking as he powered down the systems. "You did it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You actually did it." Marcus didn't respond. He was still processing, still feeling the weight of the storm, the runway, the lives in his hands. Carlathia, the flight attendant, was still with Reynolds, her hands moving mechanically as she continued CPR. "He's got a pulse," she said suddenly, her voice breaking with hope. "It's weak, but it's there. Get the medics up here," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. He stood, his legs unsteady, and pushed through the curtain into the cabin. The passengers' faces were a blur, some clapping, some crying, some staring at him like he was a ghost. And then he saw Elias, those soft brown eyes wide with relief, and something in Marcus's chest loosened. Elias stood, ignoring the protests of the flight attendants, and met Marcus halfway down the aisle. "You're insane," Elias said, his voice trembling with a mix of laughter and tears. "You actually landed it." Marcus managed a weak smile, that dimple flashing. "Told you I could." Before Elias could respond, the man who'd mocked him earlier stood, his face flushed. "Hey, buddy, you're no pilot," he snapped, his earlier bravado returning now that the danger had passed. "Sit down and let the professionals handle this." Marcus's eyes darkened, but before he could respond, Elias stepped forward, his voice sharp. "You just saved your life. Show some respect." The man blinked, stunned, and sat down, his wife pulling him back. The cabin door burst open, and paramedics rushed in, heading straight for the cockpit. The passengers were ushered off the plane, a steady stream of shaken people stepping onto the wet tarmac. Elias lingered, waiting for Marcus, who emerged last, his blazer rumpled, his face drawn but radiant with quiet pride. "You okay?" Marcus asked, his hand brushing Elias's arm, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through him. Yeah, Elias said, his voice soft. Thanks to you. They stood on the tarmac, rain soaking their clothes, the air electric with the storm's fading energy. Elias's scarf clung to his neck, a vibrant streak of color against the gray evening. I thought you were scared of flying, he said, a teasing lilt in his voice. Marcus laughed, a low, warm sound. I was, but I couldn't let you down. Elias's heart skipped. He didn't know what to say, so he just smiled, feeling a connection that felt both new and inevitable. The rain slowed, and the airport lights cast a soft glow over them, a moment suspended in time. The passengers were herded toward the terminal, but Elias and Marcus lingered, their eyes locked. You're braver than you think, Marcus said, his voice low, intimate. Wearing that scarf, being yourself, that takes guts. Elias's throat tightened. You're not so bad yourself, he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. They were ushered inside, but the moment lingered, a spark in the rain-soaked night. Inside the terminal, the chaos of the emergency landing began to settle, but the air buzzed with adrenaline. Elias stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain streak down the glass, his teal scarf now draped over his shoulders, still damp but vibrant. Marcus approached, his steps steady despite the exhaustion etched into his face. The terminal was a hive of activity, paramedics tending to Captain Reynolds, passengers recounting the ordeal to reporters, airline staff scrambling to manage the aftermath. You holding up? Marcus asked, his voice a low rumble, his dark eyes searching Elias's face. Elias nodded, his lips curving into a faint smile. Barely. You. Marcus shrugged, his dimple flickering. I've had better days. They shared a quiet laugh, the sound swallowed by the hum of the terminal. Elias felt the weight of the moment, the near-death experience binding them in a way he couldn't explain. Marcus had saved them all, but it was more than that. His courage, his calm under fire. It was a quiet heroism that made Elias's chest ache. You didn't have to do it, Elias said, his voice soft but steady. You could have stayed in your seat, let someone else try. But you didn't. Marcus's gaze dropped, his jaw tight. I'm no hero, Elias. I just did what I was trained to do. Bullshit, Elias said, surprising himself with the sharpness of his tone. You were scared, but you stepped up. That's not just training. That's who you are. Marcus looked up, his eyes softening, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through his guarded exterior. You make it sound like I'm some kind of saint. I'm not. I've got my own baggage, you know. Elias tilted his head, curious. Like what? Marcus hesitated, then leaned against the window beside Elias, their shoulders brushing. I got fired from my last gig. My boss didn't like that I'm bi. Said I was a distraction. His voice was low, bitter but steady. I've been running from that for a while, taking desk jobs, avoiding the cockpit. Today I didn't have a choice. Elias's heart clenched. He knew that kind of pain, the kind that came from being judged for who you are. You proved them wrong today, he said fiercely. You're a damn good pilot, and they're idiots for letting you go. Marcus's lips twitched, that dimple flashing again. You're something else, Elias. The compliment landed like a spark, igniting something warm in Elias's chest. He wanted to say more, but a gate agent interrupted, calling Marcus away for a debrief with the airline and NTSB officials. Elias watched him go, his tailored blazer still crisp despite the rain, his stride confident but weary. Alone now, Elias found a quiet corner in the terminal, sinking into a chair. He pulled his scarf into his hands, running his fingers over the soft fabric, his sister's gift to him when he came out. Be you, she'd said, her voice fierce with love. He'd worn it ever since, a badge of courage, but today it felt heavier, like a reminder of every stare, every whisper he'd endured on the plane. His phone buzzed, a text from his sister, checking in. Heard about the flight. You okay? He typed a quick reply, his hands shaking slightly. I'm fine, thanks to a hero named Marcus. He paused, then added, tell you more later. The terminal was cold, sterile, but Elias's mind was back on the plane, replaying Marcus's steady voice over the intercom, his hands on the yoke, guiding them through the storm. He didn't know Marcus, not really, but he felt like he did, like they'd shared something deeper than a flight. He thought of Marcus's confession, the pain of being pushed out for being himself, and felt a kinship that made his heart race. Hours later, Marcus returned, his face drawn but his eyes bright when they met Elias's. They're keeping Reynolds in the hospital, he said. Stable, but it's touch and go. Elias nodded, his throat tight. You gave him a chance. That's more than anyone else could have done. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, looking away. They want me to stick around for the investigation. Could take a while. Stay, Elias said, his voice soft but firm. You belong here. Marcus's eyes locked onto his, a spark passing between them. The terminal faded away, and for a moment, it was just them, two men who'd faced death together and come out stronger. The rain had stopped, leaving Denver's airport slick and gleaming under the artificial lights. Elias stood outside the terminal, his scarf a bright splash of color against his dark jacket, his eyes scanning the crowd for Marcus. The NTSB debrief had dragged on, and Elias had waited, unable to leave without seeing him again. Marcus emerged from a side door, his blazer slightly wrinkled now, his face etched with fatigue but lit with quiet strength. He spotted Elias and paused, that dimple flickering as he approached. You didn't have to wait, he said, his voice warm, teasing. Yeah, I did, Elias replied, his heart pounding. I owe you, Marcus. We all do. Marcus shook his head, his dark eyes glinting. You don't owe me anything. I'm just glad you're okay. Elias stepped closer, the air between them electric. You're wrong. I owe you a drink at least. He grinned, trying to lighten the moment, but his voice carried a deeper current. Marcus laughed, the sound low and rich, easing the tension in Elias's chest. I'll take you up on that. They found a quiet bar in the terminal, a dimly lit corner with a view of the tarmac. Over whiskey and ginger ale, they talked, their words weaving a fragile bridge between them. Marcus shared more about his past, the thrill of flying, the sting of rejection, the way he'd buried his love for the cockpit under shame and doubt. Elias listened, his heart aching, recognizing the weight of living in a world that didn't always accept you. I know what it's like, Elias said, his fingers brushing Marcus's hand on the table, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver through him. The whispers, the looks. I've been out for years, but it never gets easier. Marcus's hand turned, his fingers grazing Elias's, warm and steady. You make it look easy, he said, his voice low, his eyes searching. That scarf, the way you carry yourself, you're fearless. Elias's throat tightened, his eyes stinging. I'm not. I'm scared all the time, but I can't hide who I am. Not anymore. Marcus's grip tightened, just for a moment before he pulled back, his dimple flashing. You're braver than most, Elias. The conversation flowed, their stories unraveling like threads, weaving them closer. Elias spoke of his move to New York, his dream of working in theater, of bringing stories like theirs to life. Marcus listened, his eyes bright with interest, his questions sharp and genuine. The hours slipped by, the bar emptying, but they stayed, the world shrinking to just them. As they left, the night air cool and sharp, Elias felt a pull and need to stay connected. Give me your number, he said, his voice bold despite the flutter in his chest. Marcus raised an eyebrow, pulling out his phone. Only if you promise to call. Elias laughed, his heart racing as he entered his number. I promise. They parted with a handshake that lingered, their fingers warm, the moment heavy with unspoken possibilities. Elias walked away, his scarf fluttering in the breeze, his heart full of something new, something alive. 2 weeks later, Elias stood outside a small New York bar, his teal scarf catching the autumn breeze. He'd called Marcus, as promised, And tonight was their first real date. The city buzzed around him, alive with possibility, mirroring the nervous energy in his chest. Marcus arrived, his tailored blazer replaced by a leather jacket, his dimple flashing as he smiled. "You look good," he said, his voice warm, his eyes lingering on Elias's scarf. "You clean up nice yourself," Elias teased, his heart pounding as they stepped inside. The bar was cozy, dimly lit, with a jazz trio playing softly in the corner. They ordered drinks, whiskey for Marcus, ginger ale for Elias, and settled into a booth, their knees brushing under the table. The conversation flowed easily, their shared experience on Flight 214, a quiet undercurrent, binding them. "You heard from Reynolds?" Elias asked, sipping his drink. Marcus nodded, his expression softening. "He's recovering. Gonna make it, thanks to Carla's quick thinking and, well, us." Elias corrected, his voice firm. "You landed that plane, Marcus. You're a hero." Marcus shook his head, his hand brushing Elias's again, this time lingering. "Stop it. I'm just a guy who did his job." Elias leaned closer, his voice low, fierce. "You're more than that. You're the guy who saw me, really saw me, when no one else did." Marcus's eyes softened, his fingers intertwining with Elias's. "I saw you because you're impossible to miss," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. "That scarf, your heart, you shine." Elias's breath caught, his heart racing. He'd spent years dodging judgment, building walls, but Marcus's words, his touch, tore them down. "You're not so bad yourself," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. They talked for hours, sharing dreams, fears, and quiet truths. Marcus spoke of returning to the cockpit, his love for flying rekindled by necessity. Elias shared his hopes for a new play, one that would tell their story, a story of courage, connection, and love. As the night deepened, Marcus leaned in, his lips brushing Elias's, a soft, electric kiss that felt like coming home. "I'm not running anymore," Marcus whispered, his breath warm against Elias's skin. "Neither am I," Elias replied, his heart full, his scarf a vibrant testament to his truth. They left the bar hand in hand, the city lights stretching endlessly before them. The plane, the storm, the whispers, they'd faced it all and emerged whole, together. Their story wasn't just about survival. It was about finding each other, about living unapologetically, about love that landed softly, like a plane finding the ground after a storm.